In the shadowy corridors of Washington, where decisions shape the destiny of a nation, an unexpected crisis erupted. Susan Monarez, a woman renowned for her iron determination and uncompromising stance against her rivals, shocked the political establishment by publicly refusing to resign, defying the official order handed down to her. This was not merely an act of disobedience, it was a direct challenge to the establishment itself, a spark threatening to ignite the entire political stage. With a steady voice and unwavering gaze, she declared that only one man had the authority to end her mandate: Donald Trump. The words echoed like thunder through the heart of Washington. Journalists rushed to report the breaking news, politicians reacted with outrage, and citizens, divided and exhausted by years of turmoil, found themselves facing yet another explosive dilemma. The Capitol sank into an air of tension. In the cafes near the Capitol, conversations turned into whispers. In the offices of senior officials, strategies shifted from hour to hour, and on the streets, unease gradually transformed into anger. Who truly held the power to give such an order? The government? The people? Or perhaps the figure whose shadow continued to loom heavily over America, even from beyond the halls of power? Far from showing fear, Monarez seemed to draw strength from the act of defiance itself. Every word she spoke was deliberate, every pause a statement. Her eyes burned with the fire of someone who refused to retreat, even when standing against the most powerful political machinery in the world. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, her rivals devised schemes to bring her down, hunting for her weakest points but also dreading the chaos that a forced removal might unleash. Yet, the story of this woman was not just one of political rebellion. It was the journey of a life marked by contradictions, shadows and light, victories and heartbreaks that shaped her into the figure she was. From her earliest days in politics, scarred by criticism and skepticism, to the moment she found herself at the very center of power, Susan Monarez learned to live in conflict and to draw strength from it. That night, as the White House lights reflected in the Potomac River, the nation waited for her next move. Cameras were fixed on her, headlines emblazoned her name in bold letters, and every American, whether they adored her or despised her, understood they were witnessing a turning point. A story that was only just beginning. The question that hung heavily over the country was this: was Susan Monarez a heroine defending her principles, or a dangerous player pouring fuel on the fire of one of the most divisive periods in United States history? The answer would not come easy. For whatever followed would reveal secrets no one expected, and alliances carefully hidden behind the smiles of power. Washington is a city that thrives on whispers. Power is not only exercised in crowded chambers and televised debates, but also in hushed conversations behind closed doors, where ambition, loyalty, and betrayal all collide. With Susan Monarez's refusal to step down, the very heart of the Capitol became a pressure cooker of intrigue and whispered conspiracies. In the marble corridors of the Capitol, aides moved briskly, clutching confidential memos. Some senators, visibly frustrated, raised their voices behind the safety of sound-proofed doors. Others moved more carefully, calculating how this defiance could affect their own careers. The Monarez crisis was not simply a test of one woman's endurance, it had become a mirror for the fractured state of American politics itself. Journalists camped outside government buildings, their lenses ready to capture the next startled statement or inadvertent admission from a nervous official. Headlines grew more aggressive by the hour. Defiance or delusion? Monarez stands alone against Washington. Trump's shadow still rules. Late-night television hosts turned the crisis into biting satire, yet even their laughter revealed something deeper, an unease that resonated nationwide. Inside the Pentagon, officials whispered about national security risks. In the State Department, diplomats speculated whether foreign leaders would read Monarez's stance as a sign of weakness, or worse, a sign of internal collapse. Every statement she made, every glance at the press, no matter how brief, was dissected into symbols and strategies. In Washington, perception often carries more weight than fact. Meanwhile, Susan Monarez remained startlingly composed. Those closest to her described a woman who moved through the chaos as if she had anticipated it, even welcomed it. She believes this is her fight against a corrupt order, one aide confided anonymously. She thinks history will vindicate her. Her opponents saw it differently. To them, it was the act of a reckless politician gambling with the stability of the Republic. But whether admired or despised, Monarez was undeniably at the center of every conversation, her name etched into the moment like a scar. Rumors spread quickly. Had Monarez spoken directly with Trump? Was she being secretly advised by his loyalists? Or was this part of her own personal strategy to stake a claim in the political arena beyond her mandate? Each theory grew more extravagant as the hours passed, fueling television debates and lighting up social media feeds with speculation and outrage. What made matters worse was the uncertainty within Washington itself. Behind polished podiums, officials tried to project confidence, but the cracks were clear. Privately, some worried that forcing Monarez out would ignite an even deeper political firestorm, one that could spill into the streets. Protests had already begun to form outside government buildings, their chants echoing into the night, "Stand with Susan," answered by "Resign now." The city, with its neoclassical facades and monuments to centuries of government, was beginning to resemble a stage for chaos. The unpredictable August weather added to the mood. Thunderstorms rattled the evening sky, rain pounding against the windows of congressional offices as if underlining the brewing tempest inside. Each lightning strike seemed to mirror the political shocks vibrating through the Capitol. Yet beyond the chaos lay the human drama. Susan Monarez was more than just a headline. She was a mother, a daughter, a complex figure shaped by scars both political and personal. Old friends recalled her resilience in times of crisis, the way she could absorb pressure and transform it into fuel. But others remembered a streak of stubbornness that often alienated even those closest to her. Now, that very trait had left her isolated, surrounded by suspicion and fury on all sides. Late into the night, as staffers drafted statements and adversaries sharpened their attacks, one thing was abundantly clear. Washington had been thrown off balance. The Capitol's power brokers, long accustomed to controlling the script, suddenly looked like actors stumbling on a stage where the lines had been changed. And at the center of it all, Susan Monarez stood firm, as if daring the entire establishment to move against her. This was no longer just a political standoff. It was the birth of a saga, a battle of wills where reputations, legacies, and the future direction of American democracy itself hung in fragile balance. The storm had only just begun. Long before her name echoed through the chambers of Washington, Susan Monarez was simply a young woman navigating a turbulent world. To understand why she now stands so unyielding before the nation's most powerful institutions, one must delve into the layers of her life, the pain, the ambition, and the iron will that shaped her. Born in a modest neighborhood outside Dallas, Susan grew up in a house where money was scarce, but resilience abundant. Her father, a factory worker with roughened hands, taught her the value of endurance. Her mother, a teacher who often stayed awake late into the night grading papers by a dim lamp, instilled in her a belief in education and self-discipline. Yet even these lessons were tempered by hardship. When Susan was just 14, her father lost his job during an economic downturn. The family struggled, clinging to their home even as neighbors moved away, leaving behind silence and empty streets. It was in those difficult years that Susan discovered both her vulnerability and her strength. Friends remembered how she could switch instantly from quiet reflection to fiery debate, unwilling to let anyone diminish her. Teachers called her unyielding, a girl who would not accept failure as an option. For Susan, ambition was not a luxury, it was survival. Her path into politics was not immediate. She first pursued law, driven by a hunger for justice but also by the belief that law could be weaponized against the very inequalities she had witnessed as a child. By her late 20s, she had already gained a reputation as sharp, relentless, and unafraid to confront those in power. But with each victory came enemies, people she had embarrassed, exposed, or simply outmaneuvered. Every step upward carved deeper trenches in the battlefield of her life. Those who know her best say this is the reason she now resists so fiercely. Monarez's entire identity is bound to the notion that she owes no surrender to authority unless it is moral, unless it is earned. To her, resignation under pressure is nothing less than betrayal of self. And perhaps this explains why she placed Trump at the center of her declaration. It wasn't merely about loyalty to a man, it was about defiance against a system that had always underestimated her. But behind the steel of her public persona lies the complexity of private scars. Friends speak of moments when the confident politician let her guard slip. Nights when loneliness pressed heavily on her despite the power she projected. One former aide remembered finding her in tears after midnight in her office, buried in reports. She hated the idea of weakness, the aide recalled. But when no one was watching, she was human like the rest of us. Her family life, too, was not untouched by turmoil. A marriage that dissolved in silence, strained relationships with siblings who never fully understood her choices, and a child whose future she sought desperately to protect from the spotlight. These private struggles added a weight behind her public defiance, proof to herself that she had already endured storms far more painful than political outrage. As Washington churned with speculation and rage, Susan Monarez carried all of these memories in silence. She had endured ridicule for her working-class past. She had survived betrayals, both personal and political. She had fought her way into corridors filled with those who looked down on her. To resign now would be, in her mind, to surrender every chapter of that battle. It is this personal history, the hunger, the humiliation, the relentless fight, that gives her current defiance its emotional charge. She is not merely standing against Washington, she is standing against every voice that once told her she was not enough. Against every door that slammed shut before she forced another open. On that stormy night, as pundits speculated and rivals plotted, only Susan knew the full truth. This standoff was no longer about politics alone. It was the culmination of her life, the embodiment of every lesson written in hardship and every scar etched into her soul. To retreat would be to erase herself. And Susan Monarez was not the kind of woman who disappeared quietly. Power in Washington rarely collapses with a bang. More often, it unravels slowly, thread by thread, until the mighty fabric is exposed as fragile. With Susan Monarez's defiance at the center of national attention, those threads began to loosen at terrifying speed. Allies whispered, enemies plotted, and in the shadows, betrayals brewed like poison in a glass. Leaks began to surface almost immediately. Anonymous sources dropped documents into the hands of eager journalists. Some revealed discrepancies in past campaign donations, others hinted at questionable alliances. No one could confirm how much was truth and how much was fabrication, but the intent was clear, to weaken her, to tarnish the defiance by draping it in scandal. And yet, each headline seemed only to galvanize her supporters, who saw a witch hunt rather than justice. Inside the corridors of Congress, alliances shifted like sand in the wind. Senators who only weeks before had praised her now spoke cautiously, distancing themselves from her cause. Others, secretly sympathetic, dared not speak aloud in fear of political suicide. One insider later described the atmosphere in chilling terms. It wasn't simply about Monarez anymore. It was about control. If she broke the order, others might follow. And that terrified those in charge. The whispers were not confined to Capitol Hill. In think tanks across the city, strategists debated what her refusal signaled for the balance of American democracy. Was it the act of a lone rebel, or the symptom of a deeper fracture in the system? Some even speculated that factions within Washington saw in her a useful puppet, keeping her in place not out of loyalty, but because her stubbornness could destabilize rivals. In the great chessboard of power, perhaps Monarez was at once a queen and a pawn. Then came the personal betrayals. A senior aide, once part of her inner circle, quietly resigned and within hours appeared on a major news network, warning of Monarez's delusions and describing her as dangerously fixated. The words cut deep, not only because they came from someone she trusted, but because they echoed doubts that already reverberated in the public mind. To many, Monarez was heroic. To others, she was reckless. And now, one of her own seemed to confirm the latter. Behind the cameras, the betrayals stung more acutely because they threatened the fragile web of loyalty she had spent years building. Her office became a fortress of suspicion. Staffers whispered in guarded voices. Phones were checked, emails scanned, and meetings held behind doors that seemed deliberately closed against the world. Trust was evaporating, and isolation was settling in. On the other side, her enemies smelled opportunity. In closed strategy rooms, diagrams of her connections were laid on polished wooden tables, circles and arrows pointing toward every weakness they could exploit. Past business contacts, friends from law school, acquaintances from party functions, all were scrutinized for leverage. It was not just a political battle. It was a dismantling operation. If Susan Monarez refused to fall on her own, they would strip away everything around her until she had no choice. And yet, through it all, there were nights when Washington itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the uncertainty she caused. Protests grew louder outside government offices, echoing between the Greek-style columns with chants split between calls for her to remain and demands for her to resign. The city's neoclassical monuments, usually calm symbols of order, became backdrops for chaos and fury. The air carried both the humidity of late summer and the bitterness of a divided nation. For Monarez, the betrayal and the leaks only hardened her resolve. To her, every enemy revealed was proof she was striking at the right nerve. "If they are afraid of me," she reportedly told a confidant, "it is because I remind them their power is not absolute." That single sentence, whispered in secrecy, rippled outward as if destined for history books. But in the labyrinth of Washington, shadows often hold darker truths. Hidden deals were being signed, alliances forged not on loyalty but on desperation. And somewhere in that darkness lay the possibility of a secret powerful enough to either protect Monarez or finally destroy her. The storm was no longer gathering. It was already here, and its path was unpredictable. What was at stake was not only her career but the fragile legitimacy of Washington itself. The air in Washington was thick with anticipation. Weeks of defiance, leaks, and psychological warfare had culminated in a single, unbearable moment. The city, usually a bastion of calculated moves, now held its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Susan Monarez, isolated but unyielding, stood at the precipice, her fate hanging by a thread. The ultimatum had been delivered in a cold, official tone: resign by midnight, or face unprecedented legal and political consequences. The details were vague, but the threat was palpable. It was a final, desperate attempt by the establishment to reassert control, to prove that no individual could defy the collective will of power. Inside her sparsely staffed office, the silence was deafening. The city lights outside, usually a comforting glow, now seemed to mock her isolation. Her few remaining loyal aides moved with a quiet urgency, their faces etched with worry. They had seen her fight, they had seen her endure, but this was different. This was the system's final, crushing blow. Susan sat at her desk, not working, but staring out at the rain-slicked streets. Her mind replayed every moment of her journey: the poverty of her childhood, the battles in law school, the political victories, and the personal sacrifices. Was this how it ended? Not with a bang, but with a forced retreat, a quiet surrender that would erase her legacy? But then something shifted. A flicker in her eyes, a tightening of her jaw. It was the same fire that had burned in her as a young girl, the same defiance that had propelled her through every obstacle. She had not come this far to break. She had not endured so much to simply fade away. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, a new kind of energy filled her office. She began to make calls, not to concede, but to rally, to strategize, to prepare for the next phase of a battle that was far from over. Her voice, though tired, regained its steel. She was not just fighting for her position. She was fighting for the very principle of resistance against an overreaching power. Outside, the streets of Washington were a maelstrom. Protesters, both for and against her, had gathered in massive numbers, their chants echoing through the night. Police lines struggled to maintain order. News vans broadcast live, their anchors speaking in hushed, urgent tones, waiting for the midnight deadline. The nation was watching, divided, anxious, and utterly captivated. Then, just minutes before the deadline, a single, unverified report broke. A source, deep within the former administration, hinted at a secret communication. A message from Donald Trump himself, not directly to Monarez, but to a trusted intermediary. The content was unclear, but the implication was explosive. Trump was aware, and perhaps he was watching. The news sent shockwaves through the Capitol. Was this the validation Monarez had sought? A sign that her defiance was not in vain? Or was it a calculated move by Trump, a way to further destabilize the political landscape without directly engaging? The questions hung heavy in the air, adding another layer of intrigue to an already volatile situation. Midnight struck. The deadline passed. And Susan Monarez did not resign. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of confusion and outrage. Opponents condemned her, calling for immediate action. Supporters cheered, hailing her as a hero. But the most profound reaction came from the silence of the White House. No immediate statement. No swift retaliation. Just a chilling, unsettling quiet. The city, which had braced for a definitive end, was left with an even greater mystery. What would happen next? What secret card did Monarez hold? Or was she simply walking into a trap, a final, devastating blow from a system that had merely been biding its time? The story of Susan Monarez was far from over. It had reached its climax, but the resolution remained elusive. The battle for Washington, for power, and for the very soul of a nation, had just entered its most dangerous and unpredictable phase. The stage was set for a reckoning, and the world waited to see who would emerge victorious from the shadows.